Good evening, everyone. Emory Moynagh here for In His Image, and we are joined today by the inimitable Sal Cordova. We are picking up a paper reading that we started on his channel. Oh, goodness. I want to say that was last night. No, when was that? We started, Sunday night? Sunday night did we start that? And last night the YouTube gremlins got a piece of us, so we decided we were going to try and come over here tonight, and hopefully the gremlins stay away. So thank you everybody for joining. We got Godzilla's here already. All right, so we got a few people here, so that's good. I know we probably won't get the same kind of audience we do on Sal's channel. He has about 400 more subscribers than I do, but hopefully we can pull this off and get some more work done on the paper, and we'll let Sal re-upload it to his channel when he feels like it. Sal, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell everybody a little bit about what you do and why we're reading this paper.
Hi, I'm Salvador Cordova. I run the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel, and I'm a molecular biophysics research assistant. I'm always reluctant to classify myself as a scientist when I see the level of accomplishment of scientists who've been in the field. So I'll just say I'm a research assistant or researcher. I'm a Christian. I'm a young Earth and young cosmos creationist, and that's just a little bit about me. And I'm really grateful for all my friends on that channel that have come to visit here, and this is a lot of fun. So I consider myself also like a fellow traveler and fellow graduate student along with Emory here.
Yes. Yeah, so for anybody who's new and maybe is porting over from Sal's channel, I'm a graduate student in biology, halfway home. Praise the Lord. And Lord willing, we'll be finishing up in a couple of semesters here with the masters, and then who knows? I don't know. Is the PhD on the line? I don't know. We'll figure that one out at some point. So what we're reading today, and I'm going to hopefully get this up on screen for you here shortly, is a paper by RH BRADY. RH BRADY is this is a fairly old paper. It's from the 1970s, late 1970s, but it's a very useful one because he basically critiques the entire fitness, differential reproduction, natural selection, et cetera, paradigm that runs within the evolutionary community. So hopefully we do have the share screen up. We do. All right, excellent. Let me blow that up just a little bit. Can you a little bit more so that hopefully some people can read that, because I want people to be able to hopefully read what I'm doing. So I've blown that up just a little bit. Hopefully you'll be able to read it. It's not the best copy, but I couldn't share the PDF copy that I have, so I had to go and get the internet version. So I apologize for that. So I don't remember exactly where we left off because we had YouTube gremlins last night, and I'm not exactly sure where we left off. But we're gonna give it a shot here and see if we're hopefully pretty close. I know we talked about the peppered moths and the melanism, industrial melanism. So
I think that was actually the last part.
Okay.
Because Mr. Jetty was commenting and saying they nailed it. So, that was about the last comment in one of the last comments in the side chat. So that's if we find that the industrial melanism, we'll find.
All right, so we've got that. I actually am on that right now. That's where I thought we were. I thought that was close, but now keep in mind this is a 22-page PDF, and we are on the 10th page. So there is no way we're finishing to this thing tonight. But we'll eventually get it finished. We will eventually get there. So I think this is about where we are here. We're just going to start with this sentence right here. Unless, Sal, you want to make some introductory remarks before we get into this, that's fine if you would like to do that.
I just one technical thing. There is a mode where you can make this fill out the screen, I think, in StreamYard.
I see. I've only streamed once before with StreamYard.
So like on the extreme, there you go.
I've just done it.
Bigger.
Yeah, there we go. All right. So we've got we've got the paper for the full screen now, and you don't have to look at. I was going to say you don't have to look at our ugly faces, but my face isn't even on the screen, so that wouldn't be fair. So just move on, and we'll go ahead and start reading the paper here. Now he is he's clarifying a little bit on the Smith paper that he's been talking about, because Smith has basically pointed out that the critics didn't bother to attack certain areas, and the response from Brady was, well, duh, because those are actually areas that aren't up for debate. That's not what the critics are worried about. And then he goes on and says, in case further clarification is needed on the distinction made above between the part of selection theory tested by industrial melanism and the part that remains to be tested, let me point out that simple selective pressure has never been seriously in question. And that's, by the way, that's true. That's true. That was even known before Darwin. That was proposed by a creationist whose name always escapes me. Good heavens! Somebody in the chat correct me because I can't remember the guy's name. But he's been basically buried in the annals of history because Darwin didn't cite him, even though Darwin interacted with him. And Warren Eiseley, actually, who's an evolutionist, actually made the claim that Darwin plagiarized from.
Edward Blythe.
Yes, Blythe. Why can I never come up with that? Edward Blythe.
Well, I'm on the board of directors of the Blythe Institute, so I should know that.
Oh. Well, in that case, Sal, yes, you should know that. But at any rate, so that's never been up for debate. That's never really been up for debate. So that certain conditions can cause selective mortality means only that some alleles can be weeded out, not that this action can combine with variation in order to optimize adaptation. Okay, we're starting with a bombshell.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Now you're. Can you drop the screen? It's just See, when we talk, that's kind of nice. It's just for the viewer's sake.
We'll do it that way.
I had some thoughts today, as we were talking, and this is really good because it's almost like splitting hairs, but you have to do it to get things right. And I was thinking, going back, I mean, there are various examples we could go to, but there's this very beautiful physics professor named Lisa Randall. In her younger years, she's just a knockout. And she's been kind of the heartthrob of a lot of nerds because she's so bright. She's a professor at Harvard in physics. Very beautiful. All the guys are just like, that's their dream girl if they're nerds. Now, the reason I point this out, I was talking about she's unmarried and has no kids. So it's not that she's not attractive, she's unattainable. Mm-hmm. And this has happened, and I do have a point with all this. This has happened, like I had a friend, she's also very beautiful, was a doctor, and she's like, how come I'm not, some years later, I was hearing reports she was pretty upset that she never got married. I'm just like, yeah, you're kind of unattainable too. And I had a cousin who got her PhD at MIT in engineering, and she said, yeah, the guys kind of shriveled once they found out. They asked her what she did, and she said, "Oh, I just graduated school." And they said, "You're bachelor's at MIT?" She said, "No, PhD." They'd kind of just shrink away. Mm-hmm. And that's just a phenomenon that happens, because of the social structure. But we do know it'd be an interesting study if this has been the case for all time, that, women would just be a little bit more choosy. If they're of a certain social standing, they want someone of equal or higher social standing. I don't know how long that's persisted, but that's been having that and other things that's been having the effect that evolutionists themselves have been noting that the IQ points are dropping because this intelligence is causing a lot of childlessness in women right now in the present society. So we could say Lisa Randall is fit to be a physics professor. She has all the qualifications. And, also for like my medical doctor friend, it takes a certain amount of level of health because being a medical doctor is very demanding physically, and she's also very intelligent. And so it's like, okay, we could say that they are fit for their task, for their environment. That's decoupled from reproductive success. we have conceptions of the idea of something, fit for office or fit for a position or fit for a task that are totally decoupled from reproductive success. What's happening with Darwin's theory, they're trying to conflate the two, and it doesn't work. And so when I was talking about the Arctic tern that travels, it's a bird that flies 40,000 miles a year, migrating north to South Pole. It's fit to be able to do that task. It doesn't mean it's reproductively fit compared to other creatures. And same for the monarch butterfly. And so in this, when Brady's highlighting this, I could say, what is this all about? It's because they're trying to defend a theory that is slowly failing. And I just wanted to say one last thing. Prior to Darwin, the purpose of the organisms was viewed to be that to make men wonder about their creator. So something like an Arctic tern or a monarch butterfly, or butterflies in general, that have all these characteristics that would actually seem maladaptive, it totally made sense. These were like Rube Goldberg machines that are just monuments to a great intelligence. It is fit for that task. And what happened with Darwin, it tried to eliminate that and conflate it with reproductive success, and you get such absurd ideas. I mean, no one would think that someone who's so gifted and talented is unfit. I mean, that's just such a negative connotation anyway for anyone to say that of anyone else. But yet, these gifted and talented people, they may not reproduce, but you can't say that they're unfit to live or function in society. They are a very good fit. They meet a need. And Darwin is this, the Darwinian view has just distorted what would be common sense notions of fitness. And I'm just trying to zoom out here and say, this is what's happening. Brady is kind of sensing that there's a disconnect, and it should have been really obvious. But people have been so steeped in evolutionary theory, they can't see it, that you can say that someone that doesn't have children or is past their childbearing years is now unfit. It just doesn't make sense.
Right. And this is something that I've kind of kicked around a little bit in my head, where I've gone, what about even just leaving people out of it? What about an animal that's born sterile? Like, that physically can't have, doesn't make a choice, but, that just simply can't. And like, is that organism unfit? Well, again, it kind of depends on what you mean by fitness. If you mean differential reproduction, then yeah, okay, but it survives perfectly fine and it lives perfectly fine. So you have to decouple reproductive success from ability to survive, and that's not something that is really often done in the literature, unfortunately.
Right, to survive and operate. So a whale is, that may not be reproducing, is still perfectly fit to operate in the sea, and it would be unfit to operate in the air or a desert. And this is perfectly clear. That is actually the better definition of adaptation, in my opinion, too. It's the ability to operate in an environment, and it doesn't have to be living organisms. It can be machines. And the idea that it dies, it's like, well, that doesn't mean it was unfit. It was adaptive in the sense it could operate for the finite time. And there's no machine that lives eternally anyway. So the engineers are perfectly fine with the idea of a finite object that had served its purpose. And like I said, prior to Darwin, and this is from the PBS evolution series, they said the viewpoint was the creatures had all these things, like the peacock's tail, which is still a big problem for Darwinian evolution, the extravagance. Yes. The purpose was to make men wonder at the genius of their creator, or, wonder about their creator. I don't remember how exactly what the PBS quote. That was actually the best part of the entire series, in my opinion, because they gave a historical viewpoint, which for the creationists, that, it really resonated with me. it totally makes sense. So the monarch butterfly, the Arctic tern, and all the quirky things in biology that should be maladaptive,
Mm-hmm.
they're created to make men wonder at their creator.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, very much. So we'll go ahead and pick up from the Brady paper. I mean, that was I wasn't. I promise I did not plan to open with that level of bombshell. But I mean, if we're going to do it, we may as well. So let's go ahead and pull the paper back up and continue on. If we did not believe in selective pressure, we would not use the metaphor of weeding, which is drawn from the selective pressure we place on the dandelions in the front lawn. But one may accept this relation without supposing that everything else must follow, and it is the optimization of adaptation that critics usually worry about. Finally, Smith moves to the canonical value of the theory. He drops the example of the laboratory and, turning to nature at large, remarks that when one looks at the end products of natural selection, i.e. the organisms, it becomes obvious that the theory forbids any number of conceivable arrangements. If these counter-arrangements were actually to turn up, the theory would be refuted. Quote, if one invents counterexamples, they seem absurd. Thus, if someone discovers a deep-sea fish with varying numbers of luminous dots on its tail, the number at any one time having the property of a prime number, I should regard this as rather strong evidence against neo-Darwinism. And if the dots took up in turn the exact configuration of the heavenly constellations, I should regard it as an adequate disproof. The apparent absurdity of these examples shows that what we know about existing organisms is consistent with neo-Darwinism. It is, of course, true that there are complex organs whose functions is not known. But if it were not the case that most organs can be readily understood as contributing to survival and reproduction, Darwinism would never have been accepted by biologists in the first place. Oh, wait a minute. Did he just forget the concept of vestigial organs? Like,
I'm not familiar with that. I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, so let me. So what he's saying here is that if it weren't, and this is Smith, by the way, not Brady. So let me. Oh, apparently I didn't deal with that well enough. Goodbye. Apologies for that. I'm living in an apartment, and I apologize for a particular individual who just managed to show up briefly. He won't be here anymore. But I thought I dealt with that. But anyways, apologies for that. What Smith is arguing here is that Darwinism was, and this was original Darwinism, not the later neo-Darwinism. That Darwinism was accepted because we knew that, hey, all these organs contribute to survival. But then we got
Smith is an evolutionist, by the way.
Yes, Smith is, and
he's using the word Darwinism. I'm sorry, I just had to notice that.
Yes.
It's just like Joe Felsenstein saying evolutionists. I'm sorry,
yes.
It's just funny.
No, I agree.
Didn't mean to. Yeah.
The thing is, Smith is arguing that, we knew all these organs had functions, so, Darwinism was accepted. But then they'll turn back around and say, well, no, we've got all these useless leftover vestiges that don't actually have any function and don't contribute to survival value. And that's evidence of evolution because, evolution is an inefficient process and it leaves stuff behind. So which one is it? Is it good evidence? Is there good evidence for Darwinism because most organs can be readily understood to contribute to survival and reproduction? Or is it good evidence for Darwinism because you got all these useless leftover vestiges, which, by the way, they've mostly left the whole vestigial organ argument behind now because they keep finding functions for them. But like that's mind-blowing that Smith's arguing, Darwinism was accepted because we knew all these organs had functions. That wasn't what was argued in the textbooks at the time. So anyway, that's completely aside from the main paper. That is completely aside from the main paper. But I just wanted to pull that out here. Okay, Nicholas, I'm going to pull your comment up on screen, Nicholas, because that's a good comment. Vestigial organs would have originally formed for survival and reproduction, so seems to still fit. Yes and no, because yes, originally they would have, but we're not looking at the original form. We're looking at the organism as it exists. And so if you look at the organism as it exists, what ends up happening is you have to look at the parts of the organism if you're going down that road. And saying, okay, well, this one has function, this one has function, this one has function. That one over there, that's a vestige. That's useless. That's left over. So you essentially, Smith wants to have his cake and eat it too, and you can't do that. So anyway, so thank you, Nicholas, for the comment, though. That was a good comment and well thought through. So let me go ahead and jump back to the paper here. And I should have probably, when I was doing that talking, brought my face back up, or my lack of face. But anyway, perhaps the last sentence gives the game away. There is nothing in these expectations with regard to organisms that was not part of pre-Darwinian biology. When Darwin formed his theory, he drew upon the same expectations. How then could we suspect that the contradiction would come from such material? Such evidence was part of the factual condition Darwin set out to explain. He had to make his theory fit this factual condition, to make it canonical with the known for the known facts, and had he not succeeded in this attempt, his theory could never have been given serious consideration at all. Well, what has this got to do with testing the theory? Right? So that's a good question. Like, what does Darwin explaining existing facts tell us about future predictions? Tell us about tests? So that's actually a really sort of a profound question. And hopefully we'll get a little bit more explanation from that as we go along here. The, quote, apparent absurdity of Smith's examples is twofold. They run counter to everything we know about organisms and thus fully counter to any expectation. But the suggestion that the theory is tested by such considerations is also absurd. Newton worked out a theory which gave an account of gravity. When he set it to work, the propensity of objects to fall downward was part of the known world to be related by the theory to other parts. Newton implied that the theory could be tested through its predictions of things we did not yet know. But no one suggested that it could be tested by seeing if objects fell up. And by the way, that's what Smith is doing here. He's asking for objects that fall up. To be fair to Smith, it is clear that at this point he is not thinking of actual testing, but merely of empiric content. He's trying to show that the theory has empiric content, has incorporated factual observation, and is not a mere tautology. But that was not the problem, and falsification becomes a serious concern only by the grace of a serious test. So basically, Smith is asking for things that fall up here. When Smith is saying, we want this fish that's got this the constellations in its tail and all this, no theory expects that. And so for him to argue that, well, that proves that natural selection is true because we don't find that, nobody else expects it either. He's not comparing it against other competing hypotheses. And
just as, I mean, I respect that. He did give some good hypothetical examples, but some things have come up that even I didn't anticipate. I may have suspected it. The observations of reductive evolution in the present and both in the field and the lab are giving us a different, maybe there's a test that some people haven't thought about to take seriously, because there's so much evidence of reductive evolution, and it's also supported by theory on so many levels that these are things that could have also falsified Darwin's theory, but weren't even considered.
Right. And unfortunately, I see a lot of that where there are things that could potentially falsify Darwin's theory and are either not considered or they just kind of hand wave them away and go, well, that's not an issue.
Yes.
At this point, the general pattern of discussion to date is visible. Critics have worried about the formulation of tests, defenders about the formulation of the theory. And where the former group found no empiric content, by which they mean no good test, the latter found empiric riches, by which they mean canonical agreement. This miscommunication is particularly problematic with Peters, 1976, who seems to be pointing to the absence of any operational formulation of the concepts that could provide a good test, but insists on couching his complaint in terms of a supposed lack of empiric content. Yet Peters is hardly more extreme toward his pole than Smith is toward his. Each will probably find in the other just the mistakes they have set out to correct. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's human nature right there. Two people on opposite sides are going to go, you're making a mistake. No, you are. And they're just going to correct each other and completely talk past each other. How important is the demand for a test? After all, the theory can be applied without going so far. Must we test? A better question for this paper might be, do we want to test? Let's look at the requirements. So now we get into a new section header, the problem of testing. All right, and before we go there, Sal, do you have any comments you wanna make while we before we go there?
Only there were a couple things I didn't completely understand in the prior passage, because this would be familiar to people with historical literature, but I don't think we need to cover it. I think this is the interesting point. So I'm just saying that in case some of the other viewers were a little bit lost. I was too. So it might make more sense as if I ever reread it, or as we go into this new section.
Mm-hmm.
So just
hopefully some of this stuff will will become a little bit more clear as we move along. So
we're halfway there. Look, 11.
Yeah, we're 11 to 22. Yeah, it's only taken.
After 3 days, we're finally halfway through the paper.
It's only going to take us 4 readings to get there. The problem of testing. The real import of a demand for a test is a demand for a formulation of the theory determinate enough to be tested. So basically, in other words, in order to test something, you have to have a theory that is formulated in such a way that it can be tested. Just strip out all the jargon there. The reasoning of the critics is based on their notion of science. They are of the opinion that a good scientific theory receives direct support from empiric evidence, and they do not count canonical agreement as support. There are certain philosophical considerations behind this attitude.
Can we pause?
Yes, go ahead.
Now, I hear the word canonical a lot, and I've heard it here. What does it mean to you? I mean, when we've used the word canonical in like engineering or math, it's just an extra word we actually don't, it doesn't help us improve our practice. So I actually never grasped what that word. I could only think like kind of in religious settings what canonical means.
When we think of canonical in a religious sense, it means something within the bounds of orthodoxy, right? It's within the canon. It's within the bounds of whatever religion we're talking about, right? Well, this is canonical Darwin or neo-Darwinism. It's within the bounds of Darwinian orthodoxy, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
That would be the way I would be thinking about that.
Now that makes more sense even of my engineering and math stuff. And I always found it funny. It's like, what does that word do? I mean, so right. This makes sense.
It's kind of been like, it's kind of been stripped of its original meaning and been used just for anything that's within the bounds of normality, I guess.
Okay.
So, let's see here. One may reflect, for example, that what empiric evidence cannot question, it cannot support. The notions of neo-Darwinism. Anyway. The notions, for example, of arithmetic are not questioned by our experience of multiplicity. No experience can ever make us believe that 2 + 2 does not equal 4. If the actual... You can tell this was written in 1979 because they're actually questioning that now.
Well, no. This is actually... I'm not trying to be controversial, but there are certain situations where this doesn't quite work out so well. Like if you take 2 rabbits plus 2 rabbits, you might get a whole bundle because they multiply. And in information theory, oh my goodness, I have seen math where like in error correction polynomials, you just have strange math where 1 + 1 = 0. But it works for the task that it's there. So this is because I've studied these things in math. I kind of get where he's headed, is that you accept certain things kind of axiomatically, and then you find the math that would fit your experience, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other kinds of math. But for what we call elementary school arithmetic, yes, 2 + 2 should equal 4. Mm-hmm. It's only like when you get into the really advanced stuff that you might invoke different mathematical fields where it doesn't even have meaning. So I'm sorry, just for any of the critics that might criticize us for that, I just wanted to point out, there are other, So go on.
One Cal, don't feel bad that you missed last night. Last night was a dumpster fire because of the YouTube gremlins, basically just like periodically stopping and starting the stream. So
that was
we
bad.
didn't get very much done last night. We really didn't get very much done last night. So don't feel too bad. So we'll go ahead and pull back to the whole paper here. If the actual enumeration of objects contradicts our calculations, we assume an error in counting or in calculation, but not in the principles of arithmetic. And since this is so, it cannot be experience that makes us believe that 4 is the proper answer. When students point to the successes of experience in support of mathematics, I can only ask them what sort of experience would make them abandon it. I've never heard a reply to that question. We are led, therefore, to ask what sort of experience would make biologists abandon natural selection. I get the feeling this is going to sting.
Okay.
Did you want to say something, Sal? I'm sorry. Did you say?
No, I just couldn't help but laugh. No, that is a very good question. What sort of experience would make biologists abandon natural selection? That's a valid question.
Yeah. Well, here we have an empirical theory, the truth of which does not rest on the accuracy of logical operations by which the theorems are deduced from axioms. In other words, it's not math. One may answer the question with relative ease. All sorts of imaginable occurrences could falsify the principle. But these occurrences fall into 2 very different categories. We could find that the theory simply does not fit the known facts, or we could generate predictions of new data on the basis of our theory and find that the predictions fail. The former possibility is limited, of course, by the growth of factual knowledge after the formulation of the theory. Presumably, the person who formulated the theory took into account the known facts at the time. It was this data, in fact, that the theory was meant to explain. The theory fits that part of the world known to the theorist at its inception because it was designed to fit it. Only the accumulation of new data after the theory is formulated could give it much trouble, and then only those facts which do not fit the previously known patterns. This sort of testing, if one may call it that, is a desultory business at best. So in other words, it's not a good enterprise. It's very bad.
That's what desultory means.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I don't have a very large vocabulary.
So desultory basically means it's not going to be very profitable. It's not going to work.
Okay.
The predictions generated by a theory, however, represent a very different possibility. Any interesting hypothesis is probably interesting because, as Goethe once remarked, it, quote, makes us believe in the connection of the phenomena, unquote. But once we have a notion of how things are connected, we may project the pattern of connection further in anticipation of observations not yet actual. So essentially, if you have a theory, you can use that theory to make predictions about what you're going to find in the future if the theory is true. When such observations are made, they either coincide with the predicted pattern and thus extend it, or they do not, and thereby create a problem for the theory. The activity of making and checking predictions tells us something about how well the theory fits its subject matter, something that its original agreement with the known world, its canonical value, cannot tell us, and does so much more efficiently and directly than is possible through the general growth of knowledge apart from such testing. It would be naive, however, to suppose that testing by generating and checking predictions could either prove or disprove the theory. This is an important point, by the way. Pay attention to this. When a hypothesis predicts that, given specified conditions, a specific consequent result, the fact that the prediction holds does indeed extend the congruence between the anticipated pattern and the observed pattern, but it does not tell us whether this congruence is coincidental or necessary. Our predictions may hold true, after all, even if our hypothesis is not true. Okay? So that's very important because what you end up with here is science being unable to completely prove or demonstrate things. Because there's always the possibility, given our lack of knowledge, that it's coincidental rather than causal. Go ahead, Sal.
We have an example of that in geocentric theory. It was able to make a particular Tycho Brahe's version of it. Mm-hmm. It actually made very good predictions of, like, say, certain planetary, not all, certain planetary motions. And, well, an easy one that coincided with geocentric theory is the sun rises and sets every day. That looked very congruent. And so that's why the Copernicus is celebrated, because it was the correct answer was so counterintuitive. All the data points look so consistent with geocentric theory. Mm-hmm. And that's why it was accepted for such a long time. And so this is very subtle. And I like the example of geocentrism as a historic example, because it took these very subtle anomalies in the data that totally showed everything was very different from what they thought. And so sometimes creationists are just too quick to dismiss natural selection. I said, there is a lot of congruence there. It may be very subtle anomalies that will be the undoing of the theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Moving back to the paper, even so, if we find that although the conditions specified by the hypothesis were met, the predicted consequence did not result, we have certainly refuted the prediction, but we have not falsified the hypothesis, for our prediction may fail even though our hypothesis is correct. So let me just build on that. You can have a correct hypothesis, but you can use it to make bad predictions. So if you don't understand the hypothesis correctly, or maybe you're lacking some data, or maybe you just, I don't know, you don't understand something correctly, you can make a prediction from a hypothesis and go, well, maybe that doesn't work. Maybe that, and then do your experiments and find out, oh, it actually doesn't work. Maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and rethink the hypothesis. Now, you should, if you don't get a result, you should rethink your hypothesis. But it could be that you're right.
He actually gives a good example. I just saw it.
Okay, so we'll move on. When we go about the business of testing, we cannot assume a simple relation between two poles of observation, i.e. conditions and consequences. If I say that the acceleration of gravity is a constant, I am not refuted by showing that a feather falls slower than a parachutist or a stone faster. I shall reply that my statement, being a general law, did not take air resistance into account. Upon closer inspection, my statement did not predict in itself what would happen if the actual objects were dropped from a height. It specified only that the contribution of gravity to the event. Were I to make all this explicit, I should say something like, if gravity were the only causal parameter involved, all such objects would exhibit the same constant acceleration. If I use the available jargon for the same point, I will say that the acceleration of gravity is constant, assuming ceteris paribus, assuming that all other things are equal, are without an effect on the consequent. Of course, in this case, all other things are not equal, and air resistance makes a big difference. That is actually a really good example.
Yes,
because
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. That was a triumph of physics to make such a daring statement. And then you have these counterexamples, but then we were able to work through that. So that was very impressive that in the history of physics, something as simple as that, because we would not have been able to have the physics we have today if people didn't persevere with a hypothesis that had some of these experiments that superficially look contrary. So this was amazing, absolutely amazing.
Right. And this illustrates very well that you can have a hypothesis that is being contradicted by experimental evidence, but the hypothesis might not be wrong. You might not be taking every factor you need to take into account.
Right. It was basically a bad experiment.
Right.
To test the hypothesis.
Right. Exactly. And that does happen, because you may not know everything. You may not. You may be lacking data. You may be lacking understanding of a particular phenomenon. There's a bunch of different ways that could happen. So just because one experiment says nope doesn't mean that the hypothesis necessarily is false. But if you do get a negative result, it does behoove you to rethink your hypothesis and make sure that it matches the data before you go further. So moving on.
By the way,
General
the fact
Go
that he
ahead.
cited that this says Brady has a first-rate mind, that he would be drawing from the history of science like that.
That's
That
actually
took
very
some
true.
thinking. Yeah, very good on him.
Yeah, you don't get biologists citing physics experiments very often. It doesn't happen very often. General principles do not predict specific events in themselves, but only specify a contribution to those events. When a particular application of a principle is made, it must always be accompanied by a ceteris paribus assumption, since in any concrete situation, other than causal parameters could interfere with the result. But when we see that in any particular test, the congruence or incongruence of the anticipation with the result may be due to parameters external to our theory, it becomes clear that tests neither prove nor disprove theories. The distance between the general principle and the particular application is too great for that. In the case of a confirmed prediction, we record the result and continue to investigate the implications of the theory, developing further predictions as we go along. If all goes well, the pattern of anticipation becomes the pattern of observation, and we may be said to investigate nature methodically. When things go awry, however, the response will be far more complicated. Faced with the reality of a false prediction, the researcher must suppose either 1, that the base theory has been falsified, or 2, that the ceteris paribus clause attendant to the application has been falsified, that the assumption that other parameters would not interfere with our predicted result was not true. Since it would be precipitous to discard the theory in order to save a local ceteris paribus assumption, it is this assumption that will be challenged by the failure of prediction. The researcher will make an ad hoc addition to his hypothesis, or will reformulate it more radically, attempting to identify the extra parameters and take them into account. Of course, since the ceteris paribus clause of any application is potentially inexhaustible, one could never know how many parameters are actually hiding under its blanket inclusion. If the new prediction also fails, we are still not finished with our investigation. We may continue to adjust our hypothesis as long as causal parameters occur to us. So basically, you can adjust a hypothesis until you run out of reasons to adjust it. Now, there's good and bad in that, because yes, your hypothesis may not be wrong, but if you continually come up with failed predictions, at some point you probably should reconsider the hypothesis.
Yes. And again, the geocentrism is a great historical example that they kept adding epicycles and trying to fix the theory, but it eventually just had too many anomalies. What ended up happening is they came up with the heliocentric theory that had practically no faults in it. It was perfect, and that's why it prevailed, because it was right. And that it also became consistent with future discoveries in physics. So let's go on. That's just the I got to say this is so interesting to hear, because so many theories in physics, usually sometimes experiments will be one way or the other. Like the modern physics, it's very conclusive, because when the Nobel Prizes were being awarded, they were getting just very straight results. And sometimes they had experiments that did violate theory and they had to readjust the theory, but there was not as much back and forth as I'm seeing here with natural selection, because the quantities in question were very well measured. Fitness is not well measured. It's not even well defined, and that's part of the problem.
Yep. So we now move on. Smith, 1978, has described the problem as it arises in current practice. Replying to a criticism of ad hoc hypothesizing by Lewontin, 1977, Smith defends the use of ad hoc expansions with reference to his own work. Quote, "What these examples, and many others, have in common is that a model gives predictions that are in part confirmed by observation, but that are contradicted in some important aspect. I agree with Lewontin, such that discrepancies are inevitable if a simple model is used, particularly a model that assumes each organ or behavior to serve only one function. I also agree that if the investigator adds assumptions to his model which meet each discrepancy, there is no way in which the hypothesis of adaptation can be refuted. But the hypothesis of adaptation is not under test. Really?
Yeah. Oh.
What is under test is a specific set of hypotheses in the particular model. I don't think Smith grasps the main point here. But I think we'll move on with Brady because I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here. But I just get the feeling that Smith doesn't quite get what Lewontin's talking about.
Yes, and by the way, it'd be the later papers where Lewontin is more forceful and clear, and hopefully we'll get around to reading Lewontin's paper 2003.
Yes,
it was devastating.
In the plan somewhere.
Yeah.
It is the specific hypothesis, which includes, of course, the ceteris paribus clause, and is therefore at this level that we make our ad hoc foray into the possibilities of other parameters. The theoretical background is left intact by this procedure, but the local application shifts. And I'm assuming he's still quoting Smith here. Quote, tests of the quantitative predictions of optimization models in the particular populations are beginning to be made. It is commonly found that a model correctly predicts qualitative features of the observations, but is contradicted in detail. In such cases, the Popperian view would be that the original model has been falsified. This is correct, but it does not follow that the model should be abandoned. In the analysis of complex systems, it is most unlikely that any simple model, taking into account only a few factors, can give quantitatively exact predictions. Given that a simple model that has been falsified by observations, the choice lies between abandoning it or modifying it, usually by adding observations.
It would have been helpful if he had actually concrete examples to help us understand what he's saying. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a little confusing as it stands right now. But basically, I think what he's saying is, look, simple models are not always going to get all the details right. So if some details aren't right, you can correct that by adding observations and trying to account for them.
I do know, Lewontin did study fruit flies, as a lot of biologists did.
Yes.
And they were alarmed that they were subjecting them to the radiation, but in terms of counting the offspring, their fitness didn't change, and everyone was like, this is ridiculous. Actually, I need to find that experiment because this was quite alarming that they were just reproducing away and they were losing organs and all sorts of things. Mm-hmm. Of course, it was a coddled environment.
Right.
But right. I think it was...
That's actually
it was very disconcerting. It's like, what are you trying to... I'm sorry?
That's actually a thing in the animal and plant kingdom, like where an animal or a plant is under stress, they'll start making offspring like crazy.
See, this is great. I'm thrilled that we're talking because because of your background, you could find things like that. I need to dig up that one on fruit flies. I think what happened, it was kind of unnerving because it's like, well, then what are you really measuring? If these fruit flies are reproducing like crazy, even under, we could tell that their organs and all these birth defects, then what are you really measuring?
Yep.
I think it was that experiment was unnerving for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And so let me just give a concrete example here that doesn't involve fruit flies. I keep aquariums. That's one of my hobbies, and I have some plants in one of them. And I had a plant in a particular aquarium that wasn't getting enough light. And you know what that plant decided to do because it wasn't getting enough light? Start making baby plants.
Wow.
That plant made like 4, 5, 6 baby plants that it just kind of stuck off the end of its leaves and dropped off before I realized that it wasn't getting enough light and could move it. Because it was like, it's under stress, it's not in a good environment, it's under selection pressure, and so what's it start doing? It doesn't reproduce when it had enough light in good conditions, it reproduced in bad conditions. Conditions that are negative. So in other words, if I wanted to make a lot of that particular plant, just don't give it enough light, it'll make lots of babies.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so that's a thing in the animal kingdom. That happens in plants quite a bit, at least in aquatic plants. I know it does because I keep aquariums and I've dealt with that quite a bit. But it also happens in some animals as well, where if they're under stress, they'll start reproducing and just crazy.
I'm going to put that on my to-do list. I need to find that experiment. I actually had cited it when I was discussing things with Joe Felsenstein. It was a very long thread on another forum, and that was actually, I think it was not just me, but the researchers at the time were also alarmed by its implications.
I mean, for evolution, those are very alarming implications.
Yeah,
you basically are trying to kill the thing, and it's making babies like crazy.
Yeah. But the thing is it was losing organs. And so how do you reconcile that with selection selects for complexity? That was a precursor to Darwin devolves. Selection is actually an agent of destruction of complexity.
Yes.
And earlier in this essay by Brady, they're trying to say selection goes after the harmonious complexification or whatever. And I'm like, that has been the traditional view. That has been the reasons that has been accepted, understandably so. But we'll go on. We'll reflect on that. I'm just going to type this. I'm going to.
Yep.
I'm going to find the literature on that. That was
Brady paper while you do that.
Yeah. I'm not going to do it now. We don't have time for that. It's going to take me hours to find it because that was another. Like a lot of good things, it's in an obscure publication. It's going to be hard to find.
Yeah. Speaking of good things, I guess I'll advertise this now. I'm going to be doing a live stream on Rumble this weekend. First time I'm basically trying it out, seeing what happens. And I'm going to be reading a paper on sexual selection. And I've actually got the paper somewhere buried over here. Let me just pull up the title of it real quick. The paper is, Do We Need a Sexual Selection 2.0? Written by Joan Roughgarden and Errol Akay. I found it today when I was researching sexual selection. And let's just say it's gold, and it's not 20 pages. It's only 4. But it's a very, very good paper. And so we're going to read that paper, and it's from 2010. But we are going to make sure that we're going to read that paper on Rumble on probably Saturday sometime. We'll figure. I'm not exactly sure what the time is, but stay tuned to all the social medias for In His Image. I can't post it to YouTube, unfortunately, because YouTube. I don't have the ability to interact with my community. But if you follow us on any of the other social medias, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Gab, et cetera, I'll make sure it gets posted, all that, and we'll have a time on Rumble. You can come over and watch. And I've got about a quarter of the subscribers on Rumble that I do here, so we'll see how many people show up. But it's more of a test to see how the Rumble thing works, especially after last night where Sal and I dealt with YouTube gremlins for an hour and a half. So moving on, back to the paper. The original model, which is falsified, may be considered to be the formulation of the general theoretical background needed to make the specific application. Since that formulation will always consist of the general principle plus a structure of assumptions regarding additional parameters, its falsification necessitates the alteration of only one of these elements. The result of Smith's discussion is, quote, the hypothesis of adaptation is not under test. Unquote. His treatment is correct, I think, and he shows a clear grasp of ceteris paribus assumptions. Compared to most defending articles, this one is exemplary. I only wish that Smith had continued his examination. After all, if the hypothesis of adaptation is not under test in the examples discussed, when is it under test? Most critics, including Lewontin, would probably like to have that question answered. Ouch. As it is, Smith admits only one serious concern. Quote, there is a real danger that the search for functional explanations in biology will degenerate into a test of ingenuity. Unquote. The meaning of his remark will be clear if their literature is examined. Consider an example recently discussed by Lewontin in 1978. A researcher studies the behavior of foraging birds. Since these birds carry the food back to their nest once they pick it up, were they to take the first item they came upon, the piece of food might be too small to make up for the energy lost in the round trip back to the nest and out again. Thus, the researcher proposes that the choice of food particle with regard to size will not be random. Instead, the choice will represent an adaptation and will optimize the net energy gain of feeding. By surveying the actual distribution of food particles in the foraging area, the researcher calculates the size that represents the optimal solution. It is not, of course, restricted to the largest food items, for these are too poorly distributed to be worth the energy needed to search them out. After all this done, the researcher compares his figures with the bird's behavior, and it turns out that the birds are biased in the direction of large particles, but not the optimum particle size. The example is not far from Smith's discussion. We get a general hit, a bias toward larger particles, and a miss on the details. They do not stick to the optimum solution. Smith would expect an ad hoc addition to the original formulation, and this is just what the researcher does next. The miss can be explained if we assume another parameter is at work. The behavior exhibited by the birds represents a compromise between the demands of energy efficiency and those of predator pressure. The birds cannot stay away from the nest long enough to conduct a proper search for the optimum particle size, since while they are gone, their young are exposed to predators. Now the researcher publishes this account. Well, the new hypothesis could not be tested, so the researcher does not suggest that it is confirmed. He merely gives the history of his investigation and his final position. What is the import of his data? Only, it would seem, that the simple model which equated adaptation directly with optimum particle size was too simple. So in other words, basically, he publishes something, but his conclusion is not directly tied to his data, because his data disproved his model.
Yes.
So he says, well, so he adds an assumption to the data and publishes it. That's essentially what that whole thing breaks down to.
That sounds familiar.
A ton. You have no idea how many papers I've read where the data, where I've gotten to the end and they've gone, well, the data didn't quite back up our original hypothesis, but here's why we think that is. I'm like, guys, take it back to the drawing board. Don't publish this garbage.
Sad to say, oh my goodness, especially in molecular evolution, they'll just say their anomaly, they make it seem like some great empirical discovery. It's like evolution's better than we ever imagined because it could do things that are just impossible. Okay, I'll cite some specific examples with promiscuous domains, where a protein is assembled from several other proteins, not really direct common descent from a single protein, but pieces all just put right in the right spot just to make it work. And they'll say, this is just amazing. Or the coevolution, that's a big buzzword now. And I just like, have you subjected this to actual statistical probability test rather than your phylogenetic reconstructions? Because it doesn't make sense. The creature should be dead, or this whole system should fail with the intermediate steps. But they'll say, oh no, the protein co-evolved with the ERV so that they bind together, so the protein will identify it. I'm just like, guys, this is not some great empirical discovery of how evolution works. It's actually a demonstration of why you shouldn't believe it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I see that all the time. I'm just like, this is getting worse and worse, because they'll find an anomaly like that looks so spectacular and say, oh, evolution works more fantastically than we ever imagined. They wouldn't say that explicitly, but that's what you get. So the example that he gave here with the bird particle size, the literature now today is even worse. And I saw one by Varkey on glycome evolution. He said, evolution's more marvelous than we ever imagined. And just like, you found all these things that would make it even worse for random mutation. And now they have a way of just.
This is a good comment from one Cal Stanfield. I think it's important to bring up. How much is publisher perish feeding into this? You can't chase the wind for weeks or months and produce nothing if your career demands something. That's actually true. I think there's some of that. I think that's part of the reason why we have some of the drivel that comes out.
Yeah.
Because people are just desperately trying to publish so they don't lose their jobs. Which I get it. If your job is dependent on you being able to publish, I totally get that you're going to, if you get something that doesn't quite confirm, you're going to publish it anyway because you have to.
Yeah, and evolutionary biologists are in a tough position because the data doesn't really agree. They have to be a little, some of that just is just very delusional. And just like nothing in statistics agrees with what you don't even attempt to calculate probabilities and feasibility. You just assume that evolution is just so more marvelous than you imagine. Of course, editors will just eat that up.
Yep. But if you dare question it, no, your conclusions are correct, but your paper's terrible. Anyway, so we'll move back to the Brady.
Yeah, look what Godzilla Freak said. Wow, look at how incredible natural selection must be.
100% true. 100% true. 100% true. Both Smith and Lewontin recognize the described procedure as a common one, but Lewontin is uneasy about the general thesis, in this case, the optimization of adaptation. He wonders how this sort of thing can be said to test the thesis of adaptation. Smith dismisses the difficulty with the remark that it was never the intent of the researcher to test the theoretical background, only the local application is under test, i.e. the simple model which failed. Their difference outlines an aspect of the problem that has been of crucial importance to the critics. So let me just explain, let me set this up for you. Lewontin, who, by the way, is no friend of creationists, okay? So don't think for a second that Lewontin likes creation. He doesn't. Lewontin is concerned that when you test, when you have a local application of the test that fails, it might reflect on the general theory, whereas Smith says no, it doesn't. Okay, that's the setup here. Let's move on. Smith had warned about the possibility that the researcher could become a test of that research could become a test of the researcher's ingenuity rather than the hypothesis. But when can we say that this has indeed happened? Where would Smith draw the line? This question seems to be the real import of the exchange between Lewontin and Smith, but as far as I can see, it was not answered. Smith never really rises to the problem of testing hypothesis of adaptation, and Lewontin, 1977, seems convinced that this hypothesis cannot be tested for the reason given above by Bethel. And by the way, go back about two videos in this series for some excellent quotes from a journalist who looked into this stuff and went, "This doesn't work, guys," and got dragged through the mud for it.
Yeah.
But here's another quote here, and I think this is from Bethel. This quote is from Bethel, I think. The example of central place foraging illustrates a basic assumption of all such engineering analysis, that of ceteris paribus, or all other things being equal. In order to make an argument that a trait is an optimal solution to a particular problem, it must be possible to view the trait and the problem in isolation, all other things being equal. If all other things are not equal, if a change in a trait is a solution to one problem changes the organism's relation to other problems of the environment, it becomes impossible to carry out the analysis part by part, and we are left in the hopeless position of seeing the whole organism as being adapted to the whole environment. Bingo!
And who's being quoted here?
This is Bethel, I think. I think this is Bethel. But
okay,
I'm not entirely sure. But whoever it is, they're dead right. Right? It's going to be very, very difficult to, if not impossible, to carry out a part-by-part analysis. Right?
And this is, again, can you read that quote? This is actually so good, I would like to hear it again.
No, we'll read it again. That's fine. The example of central place foraging illustrates a basic assumption of all such engineering analysis, that of ceteris paribus, or all other things being equal. In order to make an argument that a trait is an optimal solution to a particular problem, it must be possible to view the trait and the problem in isolation, all other things being equal. If all other things are not equal, if a change in a trait as a solution to one problem changes the organism's relation to other problems of the environment, it becomes impossible to carry out the analysis part by part, and we are left in the hopeless position of seeing the whole organism as being adapted to the whole environment.
Excellent. Excellent.
Again, this is an outsider's perspective, though. If this is Bethel, I think this is a Bethel quote. This is an outsider perspective. This is a guy who was a journalist.
Well, because having been in the engineering field, you see all that. You can many times you can say this is an optimal solution under this constraint, and this part is optimal for it. It may actually be negative to the whole.
Right.
A good example, and this was one that's very problematic for Darwinism. The space shuttles, they have 5 navigation systems that are all equivalent. If 4 of them die, you have one that's able to carry the spacecraft all the way back.
Right.
Now, it's not optimal for weight, and it's very expensive to be adding more weight and mechanisms, but that's really important that you have a backup system.
Right.
So in terms of the isolated part, it's very optimal in terms of redundancy, or it's at least better than just having one. There may not be a simple answer to what is optimal, like how many extra navigation systems do you need? But for some reason they picked 5. And the biophysicists are able to isolate things in isolation. Like, again, the Arctic tern, going back to the Arctic tern or the monarch butterfly, their magnetic navigation systems are optimal in terms of the physics. But we're not going to be able to judge that by looking at the organism and saying, oh, look at all the reproductive success. We're able to judge that the magnetic solution of the quantum spin chemistry is optimal. You won't know that unless you study the physics. So this means it's a very bad metric for judging the optimality of individual systems, for sure.
Yep. I'm not sure that there is a way to judge the optimization of individual systems. I'm not sure that would be very, very difficult unless you could duplicate the system outside of the organism and test it that way, which would be very, very difficult. So I'm not sure.
Well, this is what the biophysicists have done. They'd said, okay, hypothetically, if we wanted to optimize a magnetic compass, we can measure that. Or like the proper lenses of the eyes based on geometric optics, we can say what is optimal because something's in focus or it's not.
Right.
That's very objective. We don't have to articulate it in terms of natural selection. And that's why I find biophysics very satisfying, is they actually know how to actually test optimality of systems. And the thing that has been shocking is, like, on every level, if we're talking about sensory organs like eyes or electric sensing in sharks or hearing or taste or smell, all the systems are optimal. You could not tell that it was optimal just on reproductive success because you have something like a blind cavefish. It's like, what kind of environment can we tell that the eye is optimal? Because we have environments that say, oh, it's better not to have an eye at all.
Yep. So, and again, this is just one of those things where Darwinism just kind of throws up its hands and goes, well, yeah. So back to the Brady paper. Bethel's criticism, when formulated according to my analysis above, is sustained by Lewontin, who evidently understands the engineering criterion suggested by Gould as a purely theoretical notion, which is difficult, if not impossible, to operationalize. But Smith's responds to all this with a judgment on what the researchers should or should not do. At no point does he undertake to examine what difficulties might be inherent in the structure of the theory itself, rather than in the practice of the researcher. Lewontin, like most critics, is worried about both the research practices and the nature of the hypothesis being researched. So, translation here, folks. Smith is only worried about, did the researcher do it right? Lewontin is worried about, did the researcher do it right, but also, is the theory right?
And this is interesting. This is 1979. It would be years later that finally Lewontin broke. He couldn't support the theory anymore.
Yep. And
so this is that's why I said this is a great historical document. Because I think at this time, Lewontin was probably like in the middle of his transformation.
Right. Around this time, Lewontin's probably Lewontin didn't completely break until later on. So this may be like, he may be just starting to get to the point where it's like, I'm seeing cracks here, and I'm not getting good answers.
Yeah.
And of course, later on, he'll write a paper. I think was that 2003?
Yep, winter 2003, Santa
where
Fe
he just
Bulletin.
blasts most of this stuff.
Oh, it was brutal.
Yeah. And the only reason, by the way, it got published is because it had Lewin's name on it. If it had somebody else's name on it, it would not have been published.
Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
Lewinson had a big enough reputation that he could afford to say that stuff and A, not get fired, and B, actually get it published. So anyways, back to Brady. If the purpose of testing looked to be a clear, straightforward business at the beginning of this section, the practice has turned out to be rather murky. It begins to seem questionable that a procedure of testing could ever be adequate to the purpose offered above. Of course, it may well be that the case that things become indeterminate when we think about the natural selection and adaptation, because the theory itself is indeterminate, and a theory of a different form would facilitate testing in a way that natural selection does not. Or the fault may lie with the procedures of the researcher, or perhaps the whole notion of testing was impossible from the beginning. These three possibilities must be sorted out. Now we'll head to a new subheader. Now, I'm just going to take a quick pause here before we head into the new subheader. We've been going for about an hour. I should have mentioned this up front and I forgot. If you have questions, comments, tag me. I am watching the YouTube chat, so feel free to tag me if you have a particular question or comment or something like that, and I will try to respond and we'll try and discuss it. I want to try and be somewhat interactive here as much as I can, and I've been reading the chat. It's just if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and tag me so that I guarantee that I see them, because I love my two screens so I can see what's going on. So anyway, moving on to determinate form, which is where we are. By now, it has become obvious that the theories are not easily challenged by tests. No theory is proven or disproven by such a procedure, and what else is left? Fortunately, there are intermediate possibilities. If a test may not decide a theory is true or false, it can, in some cases, decide whether a theory is superior or inferior to another contender. This is perhaps its strongest form, but there are still other applications. Even when there are no alternative theories to dispute the field, successful predictions extend the known pattern of relations, discovering novel facts, and perhaps even shifting the interpretation of the theory and the universe to which it applies. Unsuccessful predictions can generate expectations concerning the parameters supposed responsible for the failure, thus investigating a closely related area. And all testing can serve to refine the conceptual apparatus by which the theory is operationalized, clarifying the relation between the language of the theory and the actual field of observation. That tests cannot prove or disprove theories and may even fail to offer any serious challenges is sometimes known as the Duhem-Quine thesis. And there's two papers cited there, although the point was also recognized in the early work of Popper. The argument is simply that since all actual applications of a general theory entail elements additional to the theory, at least a ceteris paribus clause and probably several other theories which are used to understand those parameters which are involved but not covered by the general theory, when attempting to estimate the impact of a particular trait on the organism's relation to its environment, we must take into account all that is known or supposed about the way that the environment works. And this will involve many other theories. A failure of prediction could be due to any one of these three areas. Faced with such a failure, we must ask before discarding the theory under examination whether we are sure of the theoretical background of the test. Does the environment really work the way we think, in the manner we have supposed? And whether we are sure that our ceteris paribus assumption is correct. Could unknown parameters be interfering? Only testing could investigate such questions, but testing, as we have just admitted, is never completely certain, since all tests involve assumptions which could be questioned. Given the possibilities of the scenario that now presents itself, Maynard Smith's comment on the danger of a degeneration to a test of ingenuity becomes very pointed. Since a test cannot disprove a theory, can it question it? What is to prevent the researcher, for example, from supposing that some unknown parameter is interfering whenever any prediction fails, and thereby insulating the basic theory from being inconvenienced by facts? That sounds vaguely familiar, Sal. I don't know about you, but I could think of a few theories that potentially applies to.
Yes, and this is, evolutionary theory is an easy one to beat up on, but there are some. This actually applies to some mainstream physics theories, where the difficulty has been very subtly. Like the Big Bang is one example right now. It's only now that they're starting to do. There have been too many anomalies that they're like, maybe the theory's not right. So what they would do is they'd put an ad hoc patch, and it held for a little bit. But when you start making so many patches, you're like, maybe this is the wrong theory. Mm-hmm. So it was accepted as axiomatic.
They've accepted, essentially, for all intents and purposes, they've been adding epicycles to the Big Bang for decades.
Yes, and I really respect the physics enterprise, and this could be one of the biggest failures of the entire enterprise, that so many people could have been duped so badly for so long. And these are really smart guys that do real physics on other levels, but then they just blew it here.
Right. And the other thing that comes to my mind is, what happens when your entire ministry has built itself around the Big Bang model?
Oh, that hurts, man. And he's one of my
who
guys,
that's targeted at.
Yeah. No, that's all right. It's fair game. It's like the Lord used Hugh Ross in my life. He's used him in Richard Smalley's Conversion Nobel Prize winner. God had his purposes, but a lot of his ministry is built around, even outside of theology, facts, inconvenient facts. Mm-hmm. Now are overturning it. It was built on speculations.
Yep.
Now looking in retrospect, and there's even parts with the speed of light. So this is actually a good paper for me, because it actually addresses things. It's really easy to beat up on evolutionary theory, but there are theories important to creationism that are important to falsify, that this touches on. So this is a bonus here.
Yeah. And for those who don't realize what my reference was to, I was talking specifically about Hugh Ross and Reasons to Believe. They've built a very significant portion of their ministry around the existence of the Big Bang, and therefore the universe had a beginning, and therefore whatever begins must have a beginner, and on and on and on. That's their argument. What's going to happen when the scientific paradigm overturns the Big Bang?
Yep. The theology's gone.
Yeah, and the entire argument just vanishes.
And I began, and just because of this, my esteem of the literal reading keeps going up, and also, therefore, also the rest of the scriptures. Mm-hmm. It's right. Like, wow.
And again, that comment is not necessarily meant to denigrate Hugh Ross. It's just I'm pointing out, when you build your ministry around a secular science paradigm, you're eventually going to take a hard fall, because paradigms do change.
Well, the thing that this is happening is, okay, there's been, I'm very much a minimalist when it comes to reading of the scriptures. I tend to, unless there's some compelling reason not to read it literally, I'll read it literally. Mm-hmm. And that goes for the Genesis account. And so in a way, the Christian scriptures have made a very bold prediction that whatever secular model that is put forward that doesn't agree with the literal reading of the Genesis account, it's wrong on factual grounds. Something, and maybe not a direct prediction, but the implication is some observation will overturn a factually wrong theory. Mm-hmm. That's what's happening with the Big Bang.
I will qualify that, Sal, by pointing out if the scientists will vet it, and Brady's about to do the same thing. And so let me just go on with Brady, because I think this will kind of make my point for me here. Such excuses could be generated ad infinitum if we were willing to do so, and eventually the only thing being tested would be our ingenuity and stamina. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, yeah.
See, I wish I'd read this paper like 2 weeks ago before I made that video on evolution as a religion, because I would have quoted this. Because that is literally what he's saying. And you could generate excuses or rescuing devices. I saw someone use in the chat ad infinitum.
ad infinitum. And just to add, specifically one component of the Big Bang is really now questioned, even by Nobel Prize winners like Roger Penrose, the inflation component. And I saw that 9 years ago when I was in cosmology class. I said, it's plain as day. I can't believe this is being accepted, and now it's falling apart. So that is a test of their stamina and ingenuity, not really a measure of the strength of the theory.
Right, exactly. So we'll go on with Brady, but I just thought that made my point for me very well.
Yeah.
Of course, the important phrase is if we are willing to do so. If we're not willing, we shall embark on one of the paths mentioned above, all of which lie between proof and disproof on one hand and mere ingenuity on the other. The strongest force that a test may take is that of an arbiter between two competing theories. The orbit of Mercury was an unexplained anomaly for Newtonian theory for 85 years. But although the ceteris paribus assumption had been fairly well investigated and no other parameter had been found to explain the unexpected path, the absence of interference could not be proved, and the theory simply lived with its anomalies.
And if I may just weigh in here, this anomaly was very subtle. It's like 5 seconds over 250 years. I mean, they're looking at the orbits here. This is how, by the way, this is how precise physicists want to be. They're like,
right.
We want to account for that 5 seconds. Our theory's close enough to be Newtonian, but that 5 seconds is bothersome.
And see, in biology, they wouldn't even care. Like, that would just be like, oh, staring at a gnat, who cares? Just being real, like, that would happen. People would go look at that and go, that's close enough.
Close enough.
5 seconds over 250 years, it's close enough. Nobody would care. I'm just being real. Like, they wouldn't. Yeah. Because biology doesn't operate with the same statistical rigor that physics does. It just doesn't.
Yeah, that level of precision. I mean, you got to be impressed that they were saying that all of our instruments are good enough to measure this, and why is this anomaly there?
Right. All right, so we'll head back to where we were here with Brady. Things changed when Einstein's theory accounted for the orbit as well as for other problems. Of course, Einstein's theory had its own anomalies, but it could account for more than the Newtonian approach. Thus, the orbit of Mercury became one of the deciding factors in the replacement of Newton's theory by Einstein's. In such a situation, given that there is a real imbalance between the success of one theory compared to that of the other, the result of the prediction can cast a crucial vote. Note that this does not mean that the superior theory is true, or even that it is truly superior. After all, perhaps Newton is correct, but the interfering parameters have led affairs to a coincidence with Einstein's predictions. The point is that given present knowledge, Einstein's theory accounts for more, and until such hidden parameters are found, we should adopt it.
Amen. I mean, that's just the way science works. And I'm actually in the camp that I think some of Einstein's theories are wrong, but we have to find out why. So,
I mean, I'm not a physicist enough to comment on Einstein's theories one way or the other. There's way too much math involved. But I will say that again, this all depends on scientists being open to changing their
views.
And most on some issues they are, on others they are not. And if you want a more full explanation on that, go watch my video entitled "What's Wrong with Is Genesis History," where I explain why evolution is both a scientific paradigm and a religious, purely secular religion, which explains why it will never be overturned. Let's see here. Since natural selection does not seem to have serious competition at the moment, we could move on to the next case. Successful prediction is of value whether or not we must decide between theories. Such successes extend the known pattern of relations in a systematic way, even as success in the research program mounted on the basis of the theory of relativity has done. Even if the theory behind the tests were wrong, the new factual material so ordered would be of great value, perhaps as the basis of a better theory when one is needed. And by the way, folks, just because Nicholas asked, I did just drop the PDF link to this paper in the chat. So if you want to read this paper, it's a scanned copy. It's not the greatest copy in the world, but it's there. So if you want it, it's there. So a failure of prediction, on the other hand, calls into question not only the basic theory, but also the theoretical background and the ceteris paribus assumption. The researcher must decide which of these is to bear the responsibility for the failure and investigate accordingly. It is possible, after all, to submit the ceteris paribus assumption to scrutiny. If a planetary orbit is found to disagree with the predicted path, we may speculate that some other body is affecting it and conduct a search for this hypothetical entity. Let me pause here. They did this. This is how they found Pluto. Okay? The orbit of Neptune didn't quite line up with the way it was supposed to. So they knew something out there was tugging on it. And by the way, they did this with another planet too, and I can't remember which one it was. But they've done this with several planets where the orbit didn't quite line up the way it was supposed to, so they went, there's got to be something tugging on it, and they went looking for it, and lo and behold, there was the thing tugging on it. Okay, so this does work.
Yeah, yes, and it's great when it's a very simple explanation.
Right, yeah.
What ends up with the sometimes when what'll end up happening is if they have an unexplained anomaly, they'll come up with a new exotic entity, like say dark matter, and it may not even be true, and then it's just accepted for ages.
Or the Oort cloud.
Yes.
They still talk about.
Oh, goodness.
Anyway, moving on.
No, but this is very interesting because sometimes you're going to hit, and a lot of times you're going to miss.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there's nothing wrong necessarily with like making a speculation, saying, well, maybe this will explain it. But then you need to find that actually is there. You can't just say,
right,
oh, this explains it, and then never look for it, or never present data that backs up your assumption.
Well, remember that comment about stamina and ingenuity?
Mm-hmm.
When they had experiments that should have detected it and it didn't, they came up with more ingenious answers as to why. It's like, oh, this is more exotic than we ever dreamed.
Add some more epicycles. Add some more epicycles, folks. Just add the epicycles.
and it really did raise the question, when are you guys going to give up on the idea? How many experiments do you have to run before you say, we're going to stop running out of excuses for it? Because right now it's resting on excuses. So this paper is actually really good. It touches on other fields, and it's good that they're citing physics experiments.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I'll also point out that when I had something and it went away. When you talk about oh goodness. When they're adding, they just keep adding these epicycles to these things. Like they just want to say, well, we're going to add this thing and we're going to add this assumption. It's not bad to add an assumption, but you got to test the assumption. You can't just assume that you've answered the question because you've added an assumption. And that's what happens a lot of the time is they add an assumption and it answers the question.
But this is where they talk about Occam's razor. Yes. It's just the feeling that you're going to get the better model, the correct model will have a parsimonious. You won't need a lot of tweaking. It'll flow from some very basic assumptions. Mm-hmm. And I just say that the young Earth, the young cosmos creationist model, it might actually fit that. If you're willing to assume a miracle of life, just say abiogenesis, just assume the miracle. Everything flows nicely after that if you're willing to accept it. Yep. A miracle at one time, and then you didn't, it was naturalistic processes after. Everything looks beautiful at that point.
Yep. Some of you may have seen the cartoon where there's this scientist drawing on the board, and he's got this big, giant, complicated equation on one side, and then in the middle he's got, and then on the other end he's got this other giant, complicated equation, and in the middle he's got, then a miracle occurs. And his colleague is saying, I think you need to be more explicit here in step 2. I would like the abiogenesis proponents to be a little more explicit in step 2. They want to tell me that they aren't appealing to miracles, and that's exactly what they're doing. That is exactly what they're
doing. That's exactly it. And so it starts to be bad when you have to keep adding more. That's why Occam's razor is just kind of a revered general principle,
right?
Because that the the saga of geocentrism failing is a classic example of that. It just kept adding epicycles, and it was kind of telling you, okay, there comes a point when you keep adding too many, you have to really evaluate whether you're right in the first place.
Right. One epicycle isn't bad. When you get to 20 or 30, at that point, you start going, okay, what's going on here, guys?
Yeah. I need to go do a show on geocentrism because it applies to so many theories in science that are contradicting creationism. And, you know,
All right,
namely evolutionary theory, abiogenesis, and the Big Bang.
Yes, it does. A lot of the same principles are at work. So let's go ahead and move back to the Brady paper here and pick up where we were. See, if subatomic events take place for no apparent reason, we may propose that they herald the emergence of a new particle and search for it. In such cases, our proposal will be limited by our calculations, for the whole sphere of operation is determined by quantitative laws. And if we cannot exhaust the possibilities of new parameters, we may make a determinate search for those which our technology puts in our reach. While doing this, of course, we shall refine our operational language in order to clarify how its terms translate into aspects of observation. As an area of investigation becomes familiar, it should be possible to specify with increasing precision what shall constitute a condition and what a consequent, and to distinguish observations which shall be part of one group from observations that shall be part of the other. Thus, even if our predictions continually fail, some gain is still possible, for the significance of these failures is cumulative when they are so systematically investigated and we can learn from them. Well, but it is not always so neat. Of course not. No, it is not, for the scenario I have sketched is merely an imagined one based on an enumeration of possibilities. As far as I can tell, the criticisms of natural selection are based upon the assumption that causal relations postulated by a theory should lend themselves to empirical examination, which means, since proof and disproof seem to be mythical, and ingenious ad hoc adjustments are often a point of complaint, that the critics must actually ask for something between these two poles. I have offered my sketch of what lies between the poles in order to pin down the critics. What do they say is missing? All the critics I have mentioned seem to agree on two difficulties. The theory is not empirically determinate, and the defenders are not critical enough. The disagreement between Mouanson and Maynard Smith seems to have this form, for Mouanson asks how the basic theory could be tested, and Smith replies, it's not under test. Folks, if you won't put your theory under test, then how good is it? Anyway, obviously, for Mouanson, Smith is neither critical enough nor possessed of a testable theory. Where Smith sees good work, Mouanson may see only ingenuity. As I mentioned above, there is a basic agreement between Mouanson and Bethel, for both find the theory too indeterminate. The level at which this indeterminacy appears, however, is now specifiable. Both are really worried about the aftermath of failed predictions. Their disagreement is with the process at that point, and the implications of that process for the state of the theory. Well, it is at that point that the ceteris paribus assumption is called into question. But unlike the case of the aberrant orbit or subatomic event, the interaction between the organism and its environment does not lend itself to quantitative investigation. We have no way of summing the contributions of various structures to the survival of the whole organism. All ceteris paribus clauses are inexhaustible, but at least some are theoretically determinate to be investigated on the basis of the same laws that are under question. The possible parameters influencing the orbit of Mercury would be calculated according to the same theory by which the orbit itself was calculated. The clause that attends our investigations into optimization of adaptation is not determinate. Neither Darwinism nor its present form neo-Darwinism contains a theoretical reduction of the organism to a determinate system. And thus, I'll come back to the end of that in a second. And thus, neither contains a way of determining the contributions of various parameters or even the number of parameters.
Oh, yeah, yes. This is really good.
Yes, explain
this is why physics experiments are comparably easier, because the number of parameters is very limited. In some of these experiments, it's mercifully not as complex. I mean, the behaviors we study have few enough parameters that it's tractable. and you can actually count them. And there was a discussion on two of our streams, one or two streams back. I said, what are the fundamental units of physics? And someone said 7, and I said 4. And that was actually a good interaction because I was looking at it. I said, yeah, you have basically 4 quantities you derive everything else from. So the field is very nicely defined. You know what you're working from. But when you don't even know what parameters, how many there are, that means you don't know what they are.
And what it's essentially saying here is that neo-Darwinism, whatever you want to call it, can't reduce organisms down to a sum of their parts.
Yes.
And that's a big problem.
Yeah. So let me just give an illustration. When the Apollo 13 astronauts were having problems trying to get back to Earth, they could rely on Newtonian mechanics. They didn't have to account, like, say, for what they, about, the things of any fine chemical details or their spacesuits or whatever. They could just calculate the mass of their composite spacecraft. All the internal details didn't have to be accounted for. That's different in biology. Every molecule counts. That's what makes physics easier. A lot of times you don't have to account for every molecule. But in biology, if you have to account for even 5% of all the billions of molecules in a cell, it's going to be challenging.
And that's one cell, by the way.
Yeah.
One cell type. You realize how many cell types are in the human body?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is impossible. It's just flat impossible. You can't reduce organisms or humans to the sum of their parts. You can't do it. There's too many complex interactions going on.
Exactly. And then if you do try to account for all the parts, there are too many.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They're just too many. And that's what makes physics actually easier. I mean, we revere it, but they have an easier task on some level. Mm-hmm. And I talked to some chemists. They said, yeah, we can't use physics principles from first principles to predict chemical behavior. We have to kind of experiment because we can't deal with all the minutia. We can't account for it all.
Right.
We don't have the computer power to do it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And what I find actually very interesting here is that Brady's admitting that Darwinism cannot reduce organisms to the sum of its parts. And I'm just going to take a little quick foray here into baraminology because that's exactly what statistical baraminology does. It reduces organisms to the sum of their parts. Arrangement of parts matters, folks. It really does. Arrangement matters. Interaction of parts matters. You can't reduce organisms to the sum of their parts. And that's by the way, that is what Darwinism tries to do in terms of selection and fitness. They want to reduce organisms to the sum of their parts.
Right. Again, they're trying to imitate the success of physics, but it doesn't apply here.
Right.
The success of physics was its reductionism, but what they were studying was amenable to that because they were not dealing with such complex interactions like this.
Right. Exactly.
Wow.
And unfortunately, statistical baraminology does the same thing, and I've talked about that on the channel before. So.
Oh, you're not a statistical. See, I don't know anything about baraminology. I've avoided that field. So you're not positive on statistical baraminology.
No, statistical baraminology is a train wreck. It is a raging, flaming dumpster fire that is about to ignite the dumpster next to it.
Oh boy. Okay, see, this is Emory. You're never shy about offering your opinions about something negative.
I mean, I'll say if it's positive too. If I thought it worked great, I'd tell you it worked great. It's just, it doesn't. It doesn't. It works terrible.
Did you see what One Cow Stampede said?
I did.
He said that is why the NCSC has their stamp of approval on baraminology in general. Oh,
one cow. Can you email me proof of that? Because I've never seen that. I would make you a moderator long enough for you to drop a link, but I can't. I'm not sure I could manage to do it while I've got the stream running. because I've actually never made anybody a mod before. But if you could email that to me, that would be amazing, because that's, not to be rude, but that is really damaging. If the National Center for Science Education is approving
Oh, just an FYI, just purely administrative.
Yes.
If you no, you would need, you can't do it from your stream unless you have a second browser. It's a mess.
Yes.
Oh well, sorry. Go on.
Okay. My email here. I'll put my email in the chat for you, one cow. Just 1 second.
Oh man,
I did not know that. I mean, I've read a ton of baraminology papers, but I didn't know about that.
They put their stamp of approval on Todd Wood and Kurt Wise. Thank you.
Oh, I mean, that's like the kiss of death. You may as well just like surrender and go home. If National Center for Science Education is approving of baraminology, baraminology's in a train wreck. I mean, but the thing is, baraminology. I don't want to get too far away from the Brady paper, but I'm going to point something out here. Evolutionists have published baraminology papers in their own journals, pretending to show that all dinosaurs share a common ancestor.
And birds are dinosaurs.
Yeah, well, that was creationists that said that. Matt McLean. But the baraminology program has been used to demonstrate common ancestry among dinosaurs.
Oh.
And Wood helped do it.
Oh.
I can pull the paper. It's written by Phil Center. I can pull the 2 papers he did, and it is just an absolute disaster. And this is one of the major reasons why I am so strongly against it. But I'm going to go back to the I'll go back to the Brady paper. We can talk baraminology some other time. But,
all right.
but I mean, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to throw a little punch in there, because like that's one of the major issues I've had with baraminology, is it tries to reduce organisms to the sum of their parts when you just can't do that. In practice, of course, certain predictions are made on the basis of individual traits, but whenever anything goes wrong, the resultant foray into ad hoc speculations invokes the notion that the summation of effects is really indeterminable. Any parameter could be interfering in who knows how many ways. Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. That's
go on.
That's the ad hoc feel of that just really, I just go, ugh. It doesn't feel like.
And see, this is interesting because Dr. Sanford actually talked about the phenomenon of interfering selection, but this is like in general interfering stuff, and you're not able to segregate it. Whereas in some things in physics, if you add more atoms, it's going to add mass. It's very simple. You don't have interference. It's nice when you can sum things up and it becomes the quantity of interest. But these are only like limited cases where you can do that nicely. You can't sum up the functionality of the individual parts and find out that it's this or that. You don't know because there are too many interactions and interferences. And so the one example that's pointed out, if you have someone who's very smart and someone who's fast, a lion comes along, well, the fast guy gets away. And so an otherwise good trait is lost. Mm-hmm. And so how do you sum that up, you know? Yeah. So...
And again, like that's very environment. That's why fitness is so environmentally dependent, because in a classroom environment, the smart guy is not going to be fit. In a jungle environment where you might get eaten by a lion, the fast guy is going to be fit.
Right. Exactly.
It's complete environmental dependency. Complete.
Right. And that makes it impossible to sum stuff up in any meaningful way. You're dealing with a realm of investigation that is not amenable to, you know, what we call scalability, right. Or summability. So anyway, go on.
Yeah, so we'll pull back to Brady here, but I just wanted to go through that real quick. No reasonable program for investigating the ceteris paribus assumption has been forthcoming for over 100 years, and none is in sight now. Critics like Bethel find this an impossible situation, for it suggests that the failure of prediction can have no bearing on our theory, which runs counter to Bethel's notion of science. The indeterminacy of the theory at this level, I think, is well documented. And just because we understand so little about the contribution of a particular trait toward fitness, it is difficult to inconvenience the theory by its failures. We cannot specify the conditions and the consequent, the this, that, of our causal statement well enough to know whether anything is seriously wrong. Because the theory is not theoretically determinate, it cannot be made empirically so. In other words, the theory is so vague that you can't empirically test it.
And by the way, I got to credit Bethel now because he was likened to Lewontin, who again is a first-rate mind in population genetics. And so some outsider, a journalist, was able to come to his conclusions. So good on Bethel.
Yes, and good on Brady for acknowledging that. Scientists don't tend to like to acknowledge people who are outside the field, but good on Brady for acknowledging that. We'll pull back to the paper. If other parts of neo-Darwinism have been well scrutinized, natural selection has escaped any serious testing and will continue to do so until we know a great deal more about organism-environment interactions. I'm sorry, Brady, but no, other parts of neo-Darwinism have been well scrutinized and should have been rejected, but, whatever. But the point being that natural selection has escaped any serious testing. And this, by the way, I'm gonna do this too. I'm gonna drop another bomb. This is why Randy Galuza can run around saying that natural selection is a myth, it doesn't exist, and so on, because they've done such a poor job actually testing it. And there are so many people in the literature who acknowledge this, that he can cite literature and say, yeah, we got all these problems with natural selection. Well, I agree there are lots of problems, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And this is where, the line is for me on him. And I keep in mind, I like Dr. Galuza. I really like Dr. Galuza. And I think he's a good speaker. And when he talks about, his talk on 5 minutes with the Darwinist, fantastic. Go watch it. It's great, great talk. But when he pushes this thing on natural selection and says it doesn't exist, which he said, and as far as I know, he hasn't retracted. I think what he's doing is he's just taking the critics and saying, well, the critics are right, and therefore natural selection doesn't exist. But natural selection in the very vaguest form that the environment influences survival value does exist.
Absolutely.
But the other claims of natural selection, the ones that are, who's the fit? The ones that survive. Well, how do you know why do they survive? Because they're fit. Well, that's garbage. I agree with him on that. I just can't go as far as he does.
Agreed.
So, and again,
I didn't know he said that. I didn't know he said that.
Speaker. And he's the president of ICR now. I mean, he's a great speaker, and I've been personally very blessed by what he's had to say. It's just that particular point, I can't go. And I'll agree with a lot of his criticisms about selection, because I think a lot of it's pretty vapid. But I just can't go quite as far as he does.
Yeah, I didn't know he said that. That's too bad.
Yeah, I mean, and when he says that, I think he's onto something. I think he's onto a point, that natural selection has been way overhyped, and we think it can do way more than it actually does. But he takes it just a step further than I can go.
Yep.
Again, if anybody from ICR watches this, this is not personal with Dr. Galuza. I love Dr. Galuza. He's a great speaker. I really enjoy listening to him, and I think he's right about a lot of his criticisms. This is just the one place I can't go. So anyway, we'll pull back to Brady here. So we are so far from a science that can reduce these interactions to a determinate system that some critics have wondered whether it makes any sense to attempt to operationalize the principle at all.
Oh,
that's damaging. If experience cannot question a theory, how can it support it? Would correct predictions mean very much if we knew that incorrect ones would not mean anything at all, at least for our allegiance to the theory? That's a good question. Questions like this are a source of frustration to the critics, even more so when they are not recognized by the defenders. It is difficult to understand, for example, why Maynard Smith, having admitted the hypothesis of adaptation by natural selection was not under test in programs that investigate it, went on as if this were no problem at all. After all, for Lewinson, it was a problem, and Smith was answering Lewinson. It may be, of course, that test or no test, the principle of natural selection is considered so fruitful that these worries pale by comparison. Since this is, in fact, a strong possibility, it would be worthwhile to explore the concept. Let's see how much more we got in the fruitfulness section. There's quite a bit here left in fruitfulness, and we've been going for about 2 hours. I think this would probably be a good place to call it. This would probably be a good place to call it right about here, and open it up for any questions that the chat has. And any questions and or comments. Okay, Godzilla Freak. I don't actually know. Does I'm gonna put this on screen because that's actually a good comment. I agree with you. Jeanson's response to Galuza was pretty good. I've read that. I've read all three of Galuza's papers along with Jeanson's response. I think it's maybe four of Galuza's papers. I think, but however many it was, I've read those and I've read Jeanson's response. It's a good back and forth. What does Hugh Ross think about natural selection? Does he throw it out completely as well? Because like I can pull up, I'd have to find it, but I have somewhere a quote from Galuza where he basically says natural selection is a myth that doesn't exist. But does Ross go there too? Because I didn't know that. If Ross goes there too, man, I already know Ross is some of the biology that comes out of Reasons to Believe is questionable. They don't think speciation happens, and I sit there and I just go, guys, stop. Just stop. Like, don't play that game with me. Like, I could sit here and show you, at least theoretically, and we've seen it happen in the Galapagos now, where you have speciation occurring. So I can't go there. I think I get what he's trying to do, but it doesn't work. And this is why I have issues with Fuzz Rana, because Fuzz Rana puts that stuff out there and I just go, Fuzz, you know better. You know better. I know you know better. I know you're trying to back up Hugh, but you know better. But one cow, I'll go back to this. I actually like a lot of what Galuza says. And this I'll kind of I guess put a little reveal out. I've been working for a while on a project on natural selection. And I've written extensively about what Galuza thinks. I actually like a lot of it. But there's just this one place where he goes that I can't go. Because I just can't, I can't say that I can't go where he does and say that all adaptation is internal rather than externally influenced, which is kind of where his idea goes. And I can't go there. I cannot go there. And Nicholas, yes, that is actually where they go. They're old Earth, but no speciation. I don't know how exactly you justify those two things, but that's where they go. And I think they go there because they're trying to avoid evolution. And they think that speciation is equivalent to evolution. But it isn't. Okay, thank you, Godzilla Freak, for clarifying, because I was thinking, like, I didn't think Ross went there, but maybe I missed something. I know Ross goes some strange places, like human Neanderthal genes are a result of bestiality. So, like, that one's like, okay, you're crazy. But I think they avoid speciation because they associate it with evolution, but that's not what it is. And so, like, I have very, very strong issues with the RTB model because of that. So it's about 2 hours. We're about 2 hours in. We've had basically we've had 6 people the entire time. We've gotten as high as 8 at one point, so that's not too bad for a live stream for me. I know Sal probably would have gotten a few more on his channel, but
well, for topics like this, I usually don't get a lot. Scare them off.
Yeah, but thank you guys. Thank you everybody for showing up. I really appreciate it. It's been a great session. Thank you, Sal, for coming over.
Yeah. So I will rebroadcast this on my channel, and just I found out today that the restream does introduce some buffering. But then when I went to StreamYard, everything was clean, but I didn't have the same problem I had last night. So there was something with YouTube, but then this is making me think that I may want to be outside of YouTube altogether. I need to start thinking about that. So, great for the idea of going to Rumble. This is a very thick paper, and I don't think I've even gotten a fraction of all the richness of it, because it made me think about things that I never saw in physics. I think maybe we were lucky. We didn't have, in many of the experiments, the classic ones that won Nobel Prizes, they're able to confirm theories or bring experiments that brought in new theories, and there wasn't so much questions or ad hoc assumptions to vindicate it. And where this is impressive is whenever we were able to build modern technologies on some of these. So like, for example, he talked about Einstein's theory of relativity and it correcting the accounting for the Mercury orbits, and then what we also call the perihelion precession or something. It's helped us do our GPS better. So it actually has physical application. The issue with this thing about natural selection, and where it's failing, there have been some tests like antibiotic resistance where it looks good, but then what about all the things where there's devolution and how that will reflect on the general theory of evolution? And there's not a lot of motivation to account for that in the peer-reviewed literature, even though it's so obvious at this point that natural selection destroys. It's just that you don't want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And even with antibiotic resistance, outside of plasmid transfer, a lot of it is gene loss and gene destruction. That's not talked about.
Yep. And like selection is both a destroyer and a preserver, because in a sense it keeps the population from accelerating downhill quickly, but it does, when you're fitting an organism to an environment, it does result in loss of genetic information. So yes, it both preserves and causes. So it's kind of a weird thing, because what it does is it goes, okay, you don't need these traits anymore because you're in this environment that doesn't require them. So it gets rid of stuff. But at the same time, it gets rid of stuff that's bad. Like, the example I used with Sal the other night was a wolf formed with 3 legs. You don't want that getting in the population. You don't want that. That's going to be bad. So that wolf's probably not going to live too long. And it doesn't even have to involve death. It can just be sterility or, any number of things. But it does remove, but it also preserves.
The term I wanted to call it, it's a broker. It means this is the price of survival. You have to give this up so that the population can survive. It becomes a broker that, there's a cost for survival, and that cost is often a loss of function or information. And we definitely have seen that outside of plasmid transfer in antibiotic resistance. Kevin Anderson had a paper, and there are like 40 some instances of antibiotic resistance. Only one of them might be even construed to be an improvement of function. So 39, the rest of them were compromised of functions, like, certain pumps in the bacteria not working so well. So, and then really, I think an honest evaluation of the Lenski experiments, a lot of the fitness improvements were loss of function.
Yep.
It's brutally obvious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then that's actually something Gavuza said, because when he was talking about the fitness of the Lenski experiments, he basically said, you know who wants those experiments to go on until the end of time? I do.
I do. Yes. Yes. This is one of the things where the creationists and ID proponents are like, yeah, go keep going, Lenski.
Yeah. Please run your populations into the ground faster. Go for it. Oh my. All right, so I'm going to close this out here because we've been going for exactly 2 hours at this point. So we will.
Thanks,
I don't know when the next one of these will be. Sal and I will probably hash that out after the stream tonight. But we will be back, and whether it'll be on my channel or Sal's channel, I'm not entirely sure. We'll see. We'll figure all that out. If it's on my channel, I will try to put it out on all the social media streams and whatnot that I have. If it ends up on Sal's, I'll try and notify everybody, hey, I'm going to be on Sal's channel. I'm not always good about remembering to do that, but I'll try. Again, thank you to Sal, and thank you for everybody coming out. I actually think that, like, the group we've got here right now, like One Cow and Godzilla and some of these other guys, it would be good to get all of you guys maybe in a room, and we can just kind of talk through some of the ideas that Gavuza's punted around, some of the other ideas about natural selection that have been punted around. I think that'd be a good, like, panel discussion, because we all kind of know that the way natural selection is currently being presented doesn't work. But what are we going to do to replace it? So I think that'd be a good panel discussion at some point we can work on, maybe a weekend or something. For those of you who have strong opinions about that, and feel free to email me or get in touch with me and kind of let me know, hey, when would work for me. Now I can't promise if you email me, I'll put you on the panel, because if I don't know you, you ain't getting on. I'm sorry. I got to know you, because I'm not getting porn bombed the way John Maddox did. It's just not happening. But yeah, so I got to know you. But if I know you and you shoot me an email and you tell me who you are, and, you know, you'd say, hey, this is what I think, you know, we can talk, we can work something out. So maybe once this paper's done, we can have a fun little discussion like that. So anyways, thank you very much for tuning in. I'll close this out in a word of prayer, and we'll see you all whenever the next one is. Dear Lord, thank you for allowing us to spend some time together this evening. Thank you for the good crowd that came out. Thank you for the helpful and constructive comments they brought out. Thank you for their willingness to come and slog through the minutia. I know that this paper is really digging into the weeds for a lot of people. So thank you that that your people are interested in going through the weeds and figuring out what's buried behind them. Lord, thank you for Sal. Thank you for the great blessing that he's been to me. Thank you for allowing him to join us tonight. Thank you for his insight and his understanding. Lord, I pray for him as he's dealing with the loss of his mom right now. Please help him and touch him and give him strength as he goes through that. And Lord, I also pray that you will just bless everyone as they go to their homes tonight, and continue with whatever they need to get done tonight, that they will have a good and peaceful night's rest and wake refreshed and ready to serve you in the morning. I ask this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Everyone have a wonderful night, and we'll see you whenever the next one is.
Sounds great. Thank you.